All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Emily Simmons, Waterfronts Network Manager. Thank you all so much for joining the webinar today. We're going to be focused on the topic of policy and governance when it comes to water funds. But before we get started, wanted to open up the floor to anyone that has any big announcements or opportunities, big accomplishments, or anything they would like to share. The only thing on my list is that in a couple of weeks, it'll be World Water Week in Stockholm. The Nature Conservancy is going to have a huge presence there this year. We're one of the key co-conveners and partners. So we've got, I think, almost 20 different sessions that we're a part of and contributing a lot. Going to have a big exhibition booth and a lot of exciting meetings going on. So it'll be nice to give a report out on that afterwards, but just as a heads up, and hopefully a lot of you are also going, and great opportunity to connect. You should definitely stop by the exhibition booth that TNC has, because we'll have some information about the network. And we've officially are pushing this network to be externally available so that anyone interested can join. And this will be our first really big event where that's a big goal of ours, is to increase membership and really enhance this community of practice. So I'll pause there. Happy to answer questions, but also opportunity to give folks the chance to make any other announcements of their own. All right. Well, there will likely be a little time at the end, hopefully focus on questions about the presentation today. But if there are any other topics that folks would like to bring in, there's time. We can also address those at the end of the webinar. But otherwise, I'll pass it on to Louise and Aparna and the rest of the group that's presenting today.
Thank you, Emily, and from my side, welcome to everybody who joined the Waterfront Network webinar on waterfronts and policy. Thank you for taking the time out of your programs from different geography and certainly different timelines. We appreciate your time, and we hope that you will find this discussion very valuable. I'm Louise Stafford, and I will be assisting today with timekeeping and make you feel very welcome on this call, and I hope you do. I'm the Waterfront Director for South Africa, and I'm based in Cape Town, where we have the first water fund for South Africa and the second in Africa, and we're also working with partners in other geographies. We will be, one thing that I can share is that we will launch our waterfront business case, the Greater Cape Town Waterfront Business Case, on the 16th of November this year, which is quite a big milestone for us. I just have two requests, and the one is that you keep your microphones on mute, and then please participate in the Q&A session at the end after the three presentations that we will have. The Q&A is as important as the presentations, because it gives people an opportunity to share things that they are maybe that they're struggling with, or the questions that we have are often questions that's across that other people also have. So please note down your questions during the presentations and share them at the end during the Q&A stage. Then I would also I'm going to introduce the three speakers now, who is Aparna Sridhar, Claudio Clems, and also Eleanor Morris. The question is, why would we have a discussion about policies on this waterfront webinar? And from where I'm sitting in Cape Town, and I'm sure many others have come across this question or the issue of policy. how do we, many cities, watersheds are outside the boundaries of those cities. And it makes it difficult for cities to invest outside their boundaries because of policy and legislative constraints, and that results in governance challenges. And then the sustainability of water funds depends on a combination of private and public sector efforts. And unless we find the mechanism to get the public sector, specifically cities, to invest outside their boundaries, we will struggle to see sustainability and long-term longevity of water funds. So we require policy shifts, and this webinar gives us the opportunity to hear from other people and other geographies and about experiences. We hear about examples, lessons learned, and tools that have been developed already in the Nature Conservancy where these things can be addressed. So, and then I encourage you to ask your questions, as I said, in the end, and then how can we apply these tools and lessons that we learn, and maybe just custom make it a bit for our local situations. With this short introduction, I'm going to ask Aparna now to start sharing her presentation. Thank you, Aparna.
Thank you, Louise, and to all of you who have joined us today on this webinar. As Louise mentioned, I'm the policy advisor working with our Global Water Program, and in my short few minutes, my goal is to offer a broad context and framework for why policy strategies matter and how we may consider designing them. As noted, I hope it offers just a starting point for a robust discussion, and including after insightful presentations from some of my colleagues. So I'm going to start off with a few statements that will probably not be a surprise to many of you who are actively engaged in the design and implementation of water funds. Sustainable watershed management requires overcoming barriers to effective governance and financing. As we all know, at any scale, overcoming these barriers requires the action and interaction of many different actors. This diagram outlines a stylized view of common actors in water management and water use. What I find valuable, there's a lot of words, but what I find valuable in this diagram is the visualization of what we often encounter on the ground. The interaction between dominant water users on the left side and decision makers, which is often in the middle, and underrepresented voices, including local communities, and in some cases, if you see that bottom box on the right, it actually says nature. These distances of how they communicate and interact can be quite far from each other. So my second statement, setting the right policy framework is a critical step for aligning incentives and actions among stakeholders. This is highlighting this really critical circle right in the middle of this box where it offers a very important stepping stone between all of these interactions. And this is because policy can set norms and standards for stakeholders, align roles and responsibilities, and it should provide a transparent process to value all stakeholder voices. Of course, this is a very relationship-intensive endeavor and requires the cultivation and collaboration across a set of actors, some of which cannot or will not interact with each other because of physical or sociopolitical limitations. Models like water funds are a means to get to the sustainable watershed management and governance structure that I think we all seek as an important vision for our mission. However, they face challenges just in themselves, securing long-term funding, and simultaneously, we also have to figure out what role does the water fund play in this large context of governance of this watershed and or basin scale. So common challenges, as Louise alluded to, and often require kind of policy approaches. They include jurisdictional challenges about investing outside of boundaries. Decision makers have very different personal perceptions as well as mandated perceptions of what they can and cannot do. There's also institutional challenges across the globe, and in many different situations, there are multiple mandates with multiple agencies and or ministries that all have some level of interaction with how to manage water. And in some cases, there's also environmental mandates, which are important for conservation goals. And sometimes they are not talking to each other, or they are meant to talk to each other, but there isn't a clear idea of where the gap is. And of course, there's financing challenges, both for executing and implementing policy strategies, but also the allocation of critical issues or critical solution sets that might have not been fully incorporated or mainstreamed in certain policy strategies and approaches. There's also sometimes a challenge about limited political demand for solutions such as investing in watershed strategies or source water protection via water funds. And this is sometimes because it's not high enough on the agenda, and/or, as we've often seen, there's not a crisis that brings that kind of issue set up to the forefront. And then just in day-to-day implementation, as I had mentioned, we know these are relationship intensive. Watersheds, communities, engaging cities, they're complex, dynamic systems. And so just including the implementation of conservation activity alongside monitoring that conservation activity and communicating is a challenge that we need to address. So how might we begin to consider policy engagement to address these challenges? It's an evolving practice that we're working to build across the Conservancy. This webinar is one starting point for us to build a larger community of practitioners who are engaging in these issue sets, but also to start offering some of the lessons learned we've been cultivating from experiences the Conservancy has had on the ground over several years, and also emerging initiatives that we are engaging across the organization. So I wanted to propose to you 3 different models to consider, and I'm certain my fellow webinar speakers will help illustrate through some real-time cases how these all start playing out. For example, addressing financing, implementation, and institutional barriers, project-level impact can be critical proof points to convince decision makers to change their practices, or to identify complementing and competing policies in support of watershed investments. This is basically focusing on evidence-based policymaking, and monitoring these impacts and how these projects are evolving and communicating how they're evolving to decision makers is critical for changing norms and making the case for securing kind of endorsement of policy as well as long-term public funding if that's a critical issue. As a tool, I wanted to note that we do have a public funding diagnostic that is on the Waterfund Toolbox, and it captures starting points to consider what kind of questions you should ask early in the feasibility design of water funds, and really recognizing that this is an adaptive and iterative set of questions to investigate what might be a public funding strategy to consider. There's also an opportunity to think about very systematically how you can incorporate policy and social impact research design as part of understanding the landscape of actors you might need to engage in moving forward. Second, not surprising, I think, for many on this call, understanding political demand and institutional or jurisdictional challenges requires a space, or at least a forum, to address and collectively discuss what are kind of perceived requests or motivations for each of these actors. When defining these kinds of mandates, it requires us considering what role these institutions or actors play in local context, but also how to actively engage them. I particularly call out actors like utilities, regulators, upstream land stewards, and communities alongside water users and customers. Not a surprise that water funds as a model is a natural convener for this kind of role. The opportunity might be to think a little bit more about what role it can play in investing in the political and policy climate across the watersheds that the water fund is involved in. Third, we can get quite targeted at any point about what norms and practices we need to change for kind of the sustainable watershed management vision we're seeking to achieve. This can be advocating for better existing policies, shifting current budget allocations, or identifying viable funding channels which could be created if the stakeholders were in agreement or in support. For example, engaging on water tariffs as one model to fully evaluate and account for environmental externalities is one aspect where engaging regulators or other actors is super critical. We'll hear from a couple cases, I believe, on how this is starting to emerge in the Brazilian context. So today's webinar is meant to catalyze our growing practice and set of cases where water funds and other models are starting to incorporate policy strategies early into design and can become catalytic actors for the policy change we're seeking to invest in. A few key questions I want to leave with you are, and will be illuminated by our other presenters and strengthened by our discussions, I hope. They are broad, but the answers to them early in the analysis and throughout the project cycle, I think, can be very critical for designing and investing in the most impactful strategies associated with policy. So with that, I'm going to stop Louise, and I will be happy to share the next presenter, Claudio.
Thank you, Aparna, and I hope that you have jotted down your questions for Aparna, and that she can answer, or that you maybe ideas that you want to share after Eleanor's presentation. Thank you very much, Aparna. As Aparna said, Claudio is in our office in Brazil. He has experience in policy and setting up easements for payment for ecosystem services. And there's a lot of Latin America is certainly leading in water funds, and there's a lot that we can learn from them. Because they've been implementing this for so long, and actually paved the way for other water funds to follow and learn from their lessons.
Well, hi everyone. Let me know when you see my screen.
It's just about to, Claudio.
We see your screen. Thank you, Claudio.
Okay. Well, thank you, Louise and Aparna, for the introduction to this topic. And yeah, I started some examples, some cases from Brazil, where water funds mingle with the Brazilian water context, water policy context. So first, I raised this question of why policy and why public. If at the water funds we have a common and simple goal of guaranteeing enough clean water in perpetuity for cities, so invariably we will face a graph like this, which accounts for costs of watershed conservation implementation. So this will apply to any project in any place of the world. So when we look at the water fund structure, we will incur in management costs, in planning costs, in implementation costs. In the case of the Brazilian initiatives, many of them you have also incentives to engage landowners. This also represents part of this cost. And then, well, we, TNC and all partners, we are very good in creating campaigns and raise money. And many times these campaigns, there are time limited. We always need to create new models to engage new donors and on this philanthropy side. But on the other hand, if we want to guarantee enough clean water in perpetuity, we have a long term also to look at. And it is, from my point of view, at this long term that policy comes in. So either we need long-term political stability. And when we talk about watershed management, you bring society together to tamponate political instability. So you have a stronger argument. At the public policy, we find opportunities for permanent sustainable funding. And in the case of Brazil, it's also at the public policy that we have the legal opportunities to invest outside city boundaries, as Aparna has mentioned before. So I'll highlight 4 cases in Brazil. One's the National Water Management System and Policy, the Water Producer Program, where a case of where water utilities raise as champions, and also the case of state and municipalities working together in bundled policies. So the federal management policy, it was established by a federal law in 1997, so it's 21 years old now, reaching majority, and indeed has a lot of lessons to learn. At this policy, one of its principles is that the watershed is established as the planning unit. So not cities, not political divisions, but watersheds. And it doesn't matter, it can be small watersheds where few municipalities are in there, or huge watershed with hundreds of municipalities, and even different states or provinces in some countries. And well, the question of being able to invest outside city boundaries is already resolved in this case. Well, and then inside this watershed, you have all this complexity of stakeholders and interested that Aparna has mentioned. So all these interests are gathered and they sit together in a watershed committee, which gathers public stakeholders, private stakeholders, civil society, academia. Everyone sits in these watershed committees, and they have a deliberative power. Then regarding the water management, this private stakeholders mostly represent the bulk water users. That means industries, water companies, everyone that takes water from the river or from underground. We're not talking here about people like us, like families, citizens in their houses. We're talking about businesses. So to run these businesses, each stakeholder needs a license. So these licenses are issued by the public entities, and the water available in the watershed, available based on technical studies, safeguarding environmental flows. The water that is available for the users is then allocated to each of one of the stakeholders, and this is negotiated inside the watershed committee. On top of that, each water user is also charged on the bulk water they take from the watershed, and there is a very important source of money for funding what is the watershed strategic plan, which is basically a plan where all the interventions focused on keeping and managing water is gathered. So we have a political representation, we have technical allocations, we have financial sources, and we have a strategic plan to implement these resources. Just to give an idea, I don't want to make this sound too complicated, but this policy, it applies to the national context, and it also applies to each state context. And so sometimes you have watersheds that run through 3 or 4 states. So these watersheds are run by a federal structure, a federal watershed committee. But each state also has its own state law that follows the same path of the federal law. So you have sometimes overlapping federal and state watershed committees, and also the water charge on both user structures. So You can have cases like in the Piracicaba, Capivari, Jundiaí watershed, which has an annual income of $6 million per year. The case of Paraíba do Sul raises $3 million per year. This is regards to the charges on bulk water. $7 million in the case of San Francisco watershed, which is a very huge one. In the case of Alto Tietê, which is a state watershed in the state of São Paulo, it congregates a lot of very important industries. It has an annual budget of $25 million per year. So there's absolutely no way in Brazil for us to talk about water funds and talk about watershed conservation without considering the opportunity that such funding represents. So taking a look at another example, the Water Producer Program. This is a program that has been designed by the National Water Agency, which is an agency that works under the Federal Ministry of the Environment. It generally focuses on soil-based management practices, but since its beginning more than 10 years ago, TNC and the National Water Agency have been working together very well in implementing such program, in implementing this program. It generally involves an agreement between all the local stakeholders. It necessarily must be customized to each local context. Sometimes it demands the passing of a municipal law to have it implemented, and many times it also uses the payments for environmental services as a means to mobilize upstream landowners to engage in the project. This program has also has big importance in Brazil. Today, there are more than 60 water producer projects ongoing under this program. On the last 2 years, National Water Agency began to release calls for proposals, so municipalities that have the first organization necessary to implement such a project, they also can assess money from National Water Agency. In 2007, this call for proposal released $1 million for new projects. Sometimes it represents seed money for beginning of some projects, but this represents also a very good opportunity. And then I highlight the case of water utilities as champions, and there we have a very neat case where the Water Funds Network has been adopted by a water company in southern Brazil. And all the technical foundations represented by our Water Funds framework, this has been done very carefully. It laid a very strong argument for the policy change and the adoption of the concept that watershed conservation is core business for the water sector. And then, with the engagement of the water and sanitation regulation sector, we actually controls the activity of each water utility. We created a very nice example where all the operational costs are inserted in the water tariff structure. So in this case, put in very simple terms, so now, yes, we as citizens, as families, we pay our water bills, and and these water bills are used by the water utility to implement its annual operational costs. And then we have the regulatory agency, which is responsible for guaranteeing to the citizen that the water utility is making a good work, so delivering water in quality. And in this case, the watershed conservation plan has been incorporated into the operational costs, just as the other regular costs, as water treatment, chemicals, water supply, pipes, sewage treatment, everything. And then also relying a little bit on the water fund structure and also the water producer project. So we have the similar entity to a water fund board, and then these funds that come from the water tariff helps to engage upstream landowners, pay the PS, the payment for environmental services contractors, do the hydrological monitoring, the restoration and conservation activities, and the water fund, which is also built up by different stakeholders, also is able to bring in additional money from other funds. So academia can also access funds that the structure, the water utility wouldn't access by itself. So at the end, it is a bundled budget. In this case, well, here are some important highlights. First, once the watershed conservation is incorporated into the tariff structure, each year the water company asks permission for the regulator for a certain amount of investment. And once authorized, they invest it. If they invest more, the next year they're compensated. If they invest less, the next year citizens are compensated with a lower tariff. But the neat thing here is that you have no funds. And in the Brazilian context, this is very important. Well, Brazil is not in a good economic condition, and we know that public agents are very eager to put their hands in any available money. So not having a fund in this case is something very positive. And at the end, these investments are shared among all beneficiaries. Moving further, well, just to mention, in a previous opportunity, I had the chance to talk about the return on investment study that we developed here, and we came to an increase of half a cent per cubic meter. In 2018 budget, this represents 1.44% of the price of the cubic meter, so very few money. Moving forward, I'll highlight the case of states and municipalities as champions, and then I'll talk about one small municipality in Minas Gerais state, which is named Extrema. This municipality isn't small in size. It has been very important by the example they're creating. They started a PS policy in 2005, creating a municipal law. And this project actually started very small and grew steadily over the years. Today, they have 245 PS contracts. The municipality disburses more than $1 million per year as incentives for landowners and also the implementation, so it became a national reference. This picture here is in this municipality, so in 10 years you can see changes in the field like this. This is a headwater that was like degraded pasture, and today you can see here with the tree behind it, it's exactly the same place, besides the cause that in these 10 years they moved up there. It's actually changing the landscape and effectively guaranteeing conserved water. So Extrema municipality lies here. So this is Minas Gerais state, São Paulo, Rio. We are in southeastern Brazil. Lies in these green dots here. And then I highlight this much larger area, which is where this project is now being replicated, being moving. This region is called the Mantiqueira mountain range. It runs over São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, and Minas Gerais state. So that's the industrial economic core of Brazil. Very important region. That's more or less the general landscape. So you see a lot of degraded pasture, and in this region, which ranges over nearly 10 million hectares, 10 million hectares, and it's a region where almost 20 million people rely on the waters that come from this watershed, from this region. A very larger project is under replication now. So the Mantiqueira Conservation Project. So it aims at 248 municipalities, replicating the case of Extrema and all the other experiences accumulated in Brazil. So to reach these 248 municipalities, 15 of them have already created their municipal laws. TNC and all the municipalities and state administration are planning to implement 16 replication hubs. And these replication hubs have the responsibility to build the political awareness, the technical awareness, the political willingness to adopt such watershed conservation approach, and then actually replicated in the neighboring municipalities. 4 of these hubs have already been created. The larger goal of this initiative is to restore 1.2 million hectares, basically turning this degraded pasture land into restored native vegetation. And this also has an economic approach. So it's restoration with economic purpose. So it creates a new economy and also produces water. This represents 10% of the Brazil nationally determined contribution to the Paris Agreement goals. And it is also rooted on national policies, which is the National Forest Restoration Policy and the National Restoration Plan. This year, 2018, as part of this federal policy, a federal decree has been released allocating $1.5 billion for restoration projects. So it's huge money coming into restoration projects, and it represents a very important opportunity. So today, a detailed business plan and a strategic restoration plan is under design for this whole region. So definitely going out of the pilot scale and going into large scale. And to conclude, well, behind all this is all the experiences we TNC are building and at the Water Fund's experience. So all the steps that are behind each of these projects, and TNC has a very important role in sharing this our expertise to make these public policies be effective. So again, looking at available and potential policy opportunities, we have to look at the local implementation capacity and then to finally have green infrastructure on the ground with upstream landowners engaged in well-managed watersheds. So TNC has a very important role here. At the base, helping decision makers to acknowledge the externalities that green infrastructure represents and its importance. To do this exert this political influence. And in here, we're not talking about lobbying, we're talking about sharing ideas. We have a very important role in promoting such peer exchange because we are with hands-on. Highlight the Water Fund's toolbox again, as this is one of the ground stones for all this replication. And well, we have a lot of experience to share. And again, just highlighting the importance that public policy has in the Brazilian context to have water funds replicated. With that, I stop here.
Thank you, Claudio. It's very informative and encouraging to see that this has been done, policy shifts, and it's possible to, if it could have been done somewhere else, like in Brazil, it's possible in other areas too, and I'm sure some of the other people on this call will also be able to share some of their experiences and hear more about how your model worked in other areas too. It's certainly something that triggers a lot of things in my own mind of where we are now in Cape Town specifically, and then replicating that in South Africa under the local circumstances. So we now Eleanor Morris, who is from our Western Montana office and the Senior Campaign Advisor from the Nature Conservancy, is now going to give us her overview.
Hi, thanks, Louise. I'm just loaded up my slides. Can you see them?
Yes, we can.
Great. I love it when it works. Hi, everyone. So I'm Eleanor Morris. I'm a Senior Policy Advisor with the Global Conservation Campaigns team. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Global Conservation Campaigns team, we're a small team of 10 that's part of TNC's External Affairs Department. And we are really your internal consultants to help you on policy and public funding. I kind of think of ourselves as problem solvers and a support system to help you figure out what it is you need to do to advance your policy and public funding goals at either the country level, the chapter level, or whatever level you guys are working at, so we can help think about different tools and research, share examples from other places. But basically just we are here to help you achieve your policy and public funding goals. So there's obviously a ton I could talk about when it comes to policy and public funding for water funds, because I think we all know that for water funds to be sustainable in the long run, they're going to have public funding. That's just kind of a critical step in the life phase of water funds. But for today, since it's come up a couple of times and it seems to be a barrier for some folks, what I thought I would talk about is the barrier of investing public funding outside of a political jurisdiction, of having a city invest outside of its political boundaries. And my main message for you is basically here in the U.S., that isn't an issue. It has not been an issue either from a voter perspective or from a legal or policy perspective. So I'm going to talk through a couple of examples of where and how this has been done, and then share a couple of potential tools that you might explore if it is a little bit more of a policy or perceived issue in your jurisdiction. So let's see. How do I advance the slide? Right there. Okay. So the first example I have for you all is from the Salt and Verde River Water Fund in Arizona. So you can see, let's see, right here in the lower part is Phoenix. And the city of Phoenix is a very large, rapidly growing city that gets the bulk of their water from the Verde and the Salt rivers that flow through Phoenix. And just for perspective, so Phoenix is down here in the bottom and Sedona is up here at the top. It's about 120 miles or 190 kilometers between the two. So Phoenix kind of sits in its own valley, and then you go through a couple of mountain ranges, and far, far away is Sedona. And it's in sort of some of the Sedona areas and some of the outlying areas that are far from the city where where the conservation activities need to happen in order to improve flows into Phoenix and protect the water quantity for Phoenix. So this is a great example of where the conservation activity is very far out of the realm of the city. And fortunately for the Arizona chapter, when they approached Phoenix and the other metropolitan areas that make up the greater Phoenix area, this was not an issue for any of the elected officials thinking about investing in activities outside of their jurisdiction. What was an issue for those elected officials is that they didn't want to spend government money where it could be perceived that they're benefiting an individual farmer or an individual person. And so when you look at the range of activities the water fund funds, the public funding only goes to a smaller segment of that. So the public funding can be used for things like stormwater recharge ponds or automating head gates, but would not go for conservation easements or drip irrigation. So it's a way where public funding can be used for some activities, and then corporate funding or other sources of funding can be used for the other activities. And the water fund gets to kind of manage what type of funding goes to what project. So one of the things I wanted to share with you all is why this isn't an issue from a voter perspective. So one of the things that we did was we did a public opinion survey to ask voters if they know where their water comes from. And what we found was that actually here in the U.S., most people have no clue where their water comes from. Only 23% actually got the correct answer. And then I have some quotes that come from some focus groups of people saying, look, I just have no idea. It never really occurred to me. I just turn the faucet on and that's good enough for me. And I think part of this comes from the fact that most people don't even know what a watershed is. So when we're talking about water funds and we're talking about watersheds, most of the public here in the U.S. doesn't know what that means. They actually think we're talking about a building or a shed to store water just as much as they are thinking we might know the right answer. So the other part of what this research showed us is that even though people don't know where their water comes from, that doesn't mean that they don't want to protect it. So there's really no correlation between voters' willingness to protect where their water comes from or their willingness to pay for activities that protect where their water comes from and whether they know where that is. So we don't really need to even educate people about where their water comes from in order to create that sense of urgency for them. They already know that water is important regardless of where that comes from. So the other example I wanted to share with you all is from San Antonio in Texas. This is a program that has been passed by voters, I believe, 3 times now. So it obviously has a huge amount of public support. So you can see on the right-hand side a kind of series of concentric circles, and those are the roads going around the city of San Antonio. The majority of the water for San Antonio comes from the Edwards Aquifer, which is most of the blue area that you can see in the slide. The city of San Antonio realized that if they wanted to continue to have clean water for their city, they needed to increase the amount of water recharging the aquifer. And so they discovered that this pink area is the recharge zone that feeds the aquifer. And so they started a conservation easement program on the recharge zone to help encourage the amount of recharge. And they passed, like I said, they had voters pass a program 3 different times over the last 15 years, creating funding to be spent in that pink area. So as you can see, not only is the city of San Antonio spending money outside of the city jurisdiction, they're spending it even outside of the county that they're in. So they're going out multiple jurisdictions to spend public funding. And voters overwhelmingly vote for this again and again. So again, there's really no policy or public perception issue of spending money outside of a political jurisdiction here. So the last example I have for you all is a little bit different, but I wanted to throw it in there, or throw it in here in case it might provide any solutions if this sort of is a legal or a policy issue for you all. So this is a program here in Montana, the state where I live, called Montana Forest in Focus. We are about 40% public land, federal land here in Montana, and most of that is on the western side of the state. It's an even higher percentage. So if we want to address any of the forest restoration issues that we have to do that on the federal lands within our state. But the federal government is not spending as much funding as we as Montanans think is necessary to achieve the forest health that we need. So the state is investing state funding in federal land. So it's outside of the state's jurisdiction, and they're spending it so that Montanans can benefit from it. And this was I wouldn't say controversial. It wasn't that voters or elected officials thought that we shouldn't be spending money on federal lands, but we weren't sure how to do it. So ultimately what happened was an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding between the U.S. Forest Service, who owns the federal lands, and the Montana state was what sort of facilitated that exchange of funding to be able to spend that money on federal lands. So I guess I just raise this to say that in some cases it might not be a big legislative change or policy change, but simply having some kind of agreement or contract or MOU between the two jurisdictions might be enough to overcome what is a perceived issue of spending funding outside of your political jurisdiction. So I think I will stop there because I always find the questions to be a more engaging part of these calls than just the presentations. And I will turn it back to Louise to guide us through any questions.
Thank you, Eleanor. Again, very fascinating, and what I find interesting is what are those, if I may kick the questions off, what the scale? Why would that caused the eventual agreement to sign the MOU? What was the message that gets that MOU in place?
Great question. So in Montana, we have a huge risk of catastrophic forest fires, and that risk has just kept getting worse over the years. The solution is to help thin, do prescribed fires, a lot of the restoration activities that we haven't been able to do on federal lands because there hasn't been the funding. And so Montana decided that rather than risk the catastrophic fires, we have to help the federal government do what they need to do on their lands. So it was really sort of the crisis of the catastrophic fires was what precipitated the MOU.
That's the saying: never waste a good crisis.
Exactly.
I'm going to now ask the participants on this call to ask questions to the presenters. So just maybe to refresh the memory, Aparna was talking about policy and governance, the tools and approaches, and things that stood out there was that if we want sustainable water funds to be sustainable, we need to overcome certain barriers, and those barriers are related to governance and finance. There's always different actors that are in the field that we need to consider and work with, bring people on board, bring the different actors on board to get the right policy framework, and alignment is something that again stands out at the different models of catalytic that can catalyze action, the impact model, convene and then influence, and then the common questions of that she suggested when we get to the policy strategies, why do we need this, the policy, when, where, what, how long will it will we need it for, what's the time frames, what are the common challenges, and what are the and that water funds are actually catalytic in overcoming those common challenges, because those, I'm sure that others can also identify with those challenges, and that water funds have, because there's no, and I think Claudio mentioned it, that water funds doesn't come with a political baggage, and the Nature Conservancy and the approach is of making friends, bringing people together around a common goal. And that's the thing that, or the aspect and the governance model that the water funds bring to the different geographies, that get people comfortable with buying into it and focusing the attention on the common objectives. I don't know, Fred, whether you have something that you want to share from your Nairobi and other experiences in Africa? Fred still here?
Yeah, it is. Thank you, Luis, and great presentations from my colleagues there. In the interest of time, I may not go to the details, but I actually want to say that many of us have a lot to learn on how to integrate policy. We all start as very enthusiastic stakeholders in establishing a water fund, but I think we start to gain more on the financial front if we engage with the policy, because that's where the big dollar is. So I've learned a lot, and I would particularly hope that we can get some of these lessons whenever we have trainings for people, to be able to provide them with this kind of examples, so that they can actually realize that public sector could mobilize much more resources for our work that can sustain activities that where we are working. However, I have a small question for Aparna that I would like to take this advantage of this moment to ask. And for Aparna, many states, including Brazil, have a lot of decentralized policy. There is county policy in some instances, there's state policies, and there's federal or national policy. And sometimes I just find it a bit of a challenge to make sure that, is it really a business to make sure they are always aligned? Or should we target, like, to really go to the policy, even if it's the county level, if it's going to mobilize the financial resources and probably human resource capacity that we need to be successful? What's your experience? Does it have to be nationally mainstream, like we try to preach everywhere?
Thank you, Fred, for sharing those experiences, and also a great question, as always. I think you bring up a very valuable and important point, and so my immediate answer is no. I don't think it always has to go to a national level. I think it is super critical to evaluate the localized kind of opportunity that allows you to get the impact and the financing source. The one catalytic question I would ask is, similar to the case of Brazil, which Claudio talked about, there is a standard that can be set if all of those institutions are aligned, and the highest level of setting the tone and the norms can come at a national level. However, sometimes that change takes a lot more time, and there is a valuable lesson to be asked, and also questions to be made of how long that investment needs to happen. So Claudio could probably illuminate a little bit more, but that change at a national level at any place is often, it takes years. So it's a commitment to a decade-long investment, but it is probably can happen because there are smaller champion successes happening at county and state levels. So my initial thinking is definitely thinking about localized impact and kind of engagement is critical, but with a longer line of sight, there's sometimes an opportunity for us to think proactively. One example is definitely a case of Peru, in which catalytic programs, including kind of the water fund in Lima, alongside smaller programs across the Peruvian watersheds helped catalyze an opportunity at the right time with the right political actors in place at the national level to want to invest in a strategy that said watersheds can be invested and that utilities would need to invest in allocating or at least identifying how they're going to think about a cash flow that would support that investment. So there was an impetus at that level that is now the challenge is implementing that policy. So I think it goes both ways. And I'd be happy to have Claudia also articulate maybe a little bit more about the National Water Law and how the Water Producer Program links that as well.
Yeah, sure. Good question, Fred. Well, yeah, obviously, in the case of Brazil, which is a huge, huge country, it's always challenging to have a national law, federal law that is appropriately implemented on the whole territory. As you could see in the slide, the map I showed of the watershed committees that had most success in their implementation, they are concentrated where the payment capacity is, where the funding capacity is from bulk water users. So the whole rest of Brazil, where there's Amazonia, there is the agricultural sector in central East Brazil. In these regions, the watershed committees didn't get very much traction until today. There is, in fact, a body of an independent body that's named the Water Observatory, which also puts pressure on governments, federal and state governments, to move this policy further. Because at the end, when you have all the stakeholders together sit in the same table deciding how watersheds are going to be managed, this is amazing. It's like, from my point of view, this is the absolute democracy, where you have everyone together deciding how their territory is managed. But in fact, as I mentioned, it's like a mirror structure that replicates in the states, with also charge on bulk water users, watershed committees, all the same instruments also they also applicate at the states, and then we're closer to to people's realities. So in the states, it gains more traction, as you could see in the values involved. And then also approaching here Jim Rieger's question on the chat, you have different layers, and the water producer program is something smaller in a certain sense as a policy, but it also involves funding. But the water producer program, it is essentially locally customized and organized around local stakeholders, and then all the funding and the funding needs comes from the local stakeholders. So it adds up one to the other, and then I think that's the need point. At the local watershed, you can add up these policies up to each other, and also the funding opportunities they represent. And then at the end, in Brazil, you have cases where you can very well operate a watershed conservation program, sometimes without the structure that we recognize in the water funds as a private fund with its own governing body. So it's a more mixed and mingled organization. But the water producer program also involves the local funds.
Thank you for that response. I also just want to acknowledge Eloise that sent this new paper to help decide what methods to use to determine environmental flow needs, to encourage people to download the paper. I downloaded it, I haven't yet read it. I scanned through it and it looks really fascinating. Thank you for sharing that, Eloise. Any other questions to the presenters? We still have about 25 minutes on the call, so happy to take more questions or comments. If there's no more questions or comments,
Louise, I just saw a question come in on the chat that says, does the campaigns team do work internationally? So I'll just answer that really quickly if that's okay.
Oh, yes, I said no. Good.
Yes, we do, Jim. We have done some work in Latin America, Asia, Europe. So if you want to know more, reach out. Happy to chat about some of our international opportunities too. Can you just describe what that work looks like? Sure. So a lot of the work that we do is helping to figure out how to get either elected officials or voters to support conservation and public funding. So helping to figure out whether it's public opinion research to figure out how to message to the public, or public opinion research to use with elected officials to show them what their constituents want. Or doing some economic benefits research to show elected officials that there's actually a return on investment of public funding into conservation in terms of whether that's jobs or dollars back to the economy, whatever kind of message it is that the elected officials need to hear. So I really think of our job as coming in, hearing what the political dynamic is that you all are dealing with, and then figuring out what are the right research products, what are the right strategies, what are the right tools that you need to do to move forward and get elected officials to do what you want them to, whether that's to pass legislation or to pass public funding, and figuring out how to run the campaign, if you will, to get that measure passed.
As we still have some time, I would add one point here that Aparna has highlighted at the beginning. When sometimes there's the lack of political demand. In the case of Brazil, it was in 2015-16, there was a severe water crisis that affected the southeast Brazil. And this has raised a lot of awareness. Indeed, at that time, at the São Paulo State governor's ward, when they finally overcame it, governor stated that the crisis was over. Very, very interesting that a government can just state that the crisis is over, and obviously it is not. It's not a crisis. It's something that's present, it's consistent, and it will stay. So now again, the levels of the reservoirs are dropping and dropping and dropping, and so this is no crisis. So from the political demand starts to raise and raise and raise, and as this becomes evident that water scarcity and the care we have to take with watersheds is something that we cannot run from. So just want to highlight this as how sometimes politicians have limited views, and highlight the importance we have in keeping the issue alive and bringing in the tools. So again, highlighting how our experience with the water funds that's now concentrated in the water funds toolbox, how this can be catalytic in creating public policies.
It's also what we did in the case of Cape Town is to start very early during even feasibility stage to look into the legal and policy requirements because of the necessity of bringing private and public role players on board or funders on board to ensure sustainability, because the public sector are already contributing toward the rate. So by putting additional funding into catchment management or watershed management seems like an additional request or burden on the private sector. But I feel more comfortable if the public sector is willing to be in to play their role in the long term, to pick up from, say, impact investment. And that's why we started thinking about policy interventions already during the feasibility stage. But it's also essential to think about it during the other stages because of the bigger buy-in that one gets over the lifespan of a water fund. And as somebody also mentioned, this is a long-term marathon. It's not a quick win because trust needs to be won, and the politicians needs to be convinced that it's in their interest. And one of the other things that we find is at what stage do you start doing it? Because when you come close to elections, different dynamics starts to play themselves out. So there's less opportunity to influence policy than it would be during early, just after election, when the new or the politicians know they still have a period in office. So that's probably, timing is also of the essence when one wants to influence and advocate for policy shifts.
It's a good point you raise, Luis. How each private or public motivates each other, and yeah, in the case of São Paulo and Rio, we actually had, following the water funds framework, organizing the private side, the private funding. And when we have a situation like we have now at this campaign in Brazil under the water fund strategy that's named the Water Coalition, and where we gather private entities into watershed conservation. When we have Coca-Cola and PepsiCo working together, like the competitors in the market are working together in a pre-competitive way. This is also compelling for public policy leaders and decision makers.
Hi everyone, Emily here. Are there any last remaining thoughts or questions from folks? Okay, well, don't hesitate to reach out by email to either myself or any of the presenters if something else comes to mind. Just wanting to thank thank you all for your time, and a special thanks to the presenters as well. This has been super useful, and very glad that this webinar has also been recorded. So I'll be sending an email to the whole network so that even though you guys attended it, you'll have a copy to the recording. And then also for those that weren't able to make it today, they can watch it on their own time. So that'll come probably later today, but possibly tomorrow, so stay tuned for that. And otherwise, there's about 10-15 minutes back in your day, and I hope you all have an excellent week.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, and bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Fred.
Great job.